share. All right, welcome. So today we have a discussion with Ashley Juavinett, Dr. Ashley Juavinett from the University of California, San Diego, where she is an associate teaching professor. Dr. Jauvinett did her graduate studies nearby at the Salk with Ed Callaway, where she did multiphoton imaging of calcium signaling in the visual system, and she assessed structure and function of the visual system, visual circuits. After her PhD, she moved to the other coast, over here close to us at Cold Spring Harbor, where she did a postdoc with Anne Churchland, and did electrophysiology and the ecological behaviors in animals to study multisensory circuits. Since that time, since she completed her training, she moved back to UCSD, where her role is primarily teaching, but also education research. You can find a preprint of hers up on bioRxiv, where she addresses the discrepancies in terms of what neuroscience graduates are learning and what skill sets are required for advancement. One of those, well, she'll talk about some of that today, I think. She also has an R25 award on preparing diverse transfer students for research careers in neuroscience, which actually I didn't talk to you about that yesterday, but I'm kind of curious about that as well, because I myself was a transfer student, because not everybody gets college right the first time. So I went through the community college system in California before transferring in. And I know as a transfer student, you just kind of get lost. You miss a lot of the freshman orientation, all of that stuff. So I assume, you know, also the transfer students are generally various income levels and different backgrounds that you might not be, they might be the first generation of their family going to college, things like that. It's a different path through, and it's a very strong system in California with the community college to Cal States and to UCs. They have set programs, so that's great. I'd love to learn some about that too if we have time. So this is the third in a series of academic careers seminar series that we put on. So thank you for the people downtown who have joined us. I'm recording this as we speak, and we'll post a recording up on YouTube on our account later on. So Dr. Jauvinett, Ashley, thank you so much for joining us, and floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and nice to be here today. So the title of my talk is "It's Your Life, but Only If You Make It So." Come back to where that comes from a little bit later in case you don't know. But this is me as a young kid. I think I wouldn't have envisioned where I was now. As a kid, I grew up in a working class family on the East Coast, and I want to start today sort of from a position of gratitude, because I feel extremely grateful to be where I am today. So what you'll see on my resume is what Dr. Hollis just talked about. So I have a PhD in neuroscience. I did a postdoctoral fellowship. I'm now a teaching professor, and a couple of years ago, I also became a published book author. But what I want to tell you about today is actually, the sort of story underneath it all. And so I'll talk a little bit about getting into neuroscience research before I even knew what that meant. Talk about as a postdoctoral fellow, and I know this will relate to many of you on the call today, how I was grappling with personal and professional choices during that time. And then talk, of course, about what I'm doing now as a teaching professor, and how, for me, that's been a really nice, flexible professional home. Along the way, I've also done a lot of research about career paths, a lot of talking to different people, and that is part of my research now. So along the way, I'll sort of dabble in some what I would call kind of a like data-driven lessons about career paths, and hopefully some of that is useful to some of you here today. So to start, I did my PhD work in the visual system. And so when I was a PhD student in the Callaway lab over at the Salk Institute, I was really curious about cell types and circuits underlying visual perception in mice. And so this is the stuff you'll find, on my resume or Google Scholar or whatever. But while I was a graduate student, I was also learning some other sort of life lessons. I was learning the power of circuit mapping and modern neuroscience techniques. And I think when I was a PhD student, this is when I really developed an appreciation for where neuroscience was going. Also learned how to code. Learned is a strong word here. I was given a bunch of code and tried to figure it out, but that's kind of where my coding journey began. And I also learned the importance of mentors that'll look out for you. This is me and Ed Callaway, who is a really great scientist, but also someone who will go out of his way to advocate for you. And I think that that was incredibly important, especially in these early stages of my journey when I didn't really know what I was doing as a first generation scientist. I also, at the time, was really grappling with just like staying sane and trying to figure out, like, is today a pro academia day or not? And that's my lab mate, Ethan. He now is a scientist at the Allen Institute, but he and I would carpool to campus and basically kind of like take a tally of like, is today a day where we want to go into academia or a day when we don't? And, you know, I think kind of integrating that information over time was super useful. I think something I tried to hold on to, and I think is really important, you know, at any stage really, but especially sort of during grad school, was that, you know, it's not really about the dissertation that you write. It's about the skills and the network that you develop. And I'll come back to this a little bit later in talking about my research, but this is a quote that I really like from this book called The Professor Is In, and it says, PhD students rest all of their hopes in the completed dissertation as a magical talisman of scholarly success, unaware that it's more than a union card. And so, you know, your dissertation and having a PhD is a thing that kind of gets you to the next stage. But the stuff that really, really shapes your career, I think, is the skills and network that you have. And that was absolutely true for me as well. So while I was a graduate student, I was also doing a lot of other things, sort of like side hustles outside of the lab. So I was writing with this group called Neurite San Diego. This is a collaborative science writing group. We would get together every other week or so and discuss each other's articles. This is one of the first things that really started shaping me as a science writer. And the other thing I was doing during grad school was a decent amount of teaching. And so I was teaching in high school through a program called NSF GRFP program. So I was going one day a week during my second year of grad school to teach and got paid to do that. I took a teaching class that was given to graduate students. And then I ultimately actually taught my own summer class at UCSD, which for me was a super formative and necessary experience in order to have the teaching training that actually got me to where I am today. Some of the research that I've done since then has, I think, made me feel even more grounded in how important these skills are to get, either as a graduate student or a postdoc, especially if you're interested in doing things beyond, you know, just strictly R1 research. And so, you know, more recently, I ran a neuroscience paths survey. This was a few years ago. And my question here was, you know, what are the skills that people develop or need in these different career paths? And so if you look across the x-axis here on this graph, you'll see there's these different groups, and there's going to be a lot of data soon. So I'll let you just sort of digest what's on this graph. So on the x-axis, these are the different career paths. So this survey included about 300 neuroscience professionals across a variety of careers. So there's people that are scientists, consultants, faculty members. And then I'm going to contrast those folks with graduate students on the right-hand side here. And we're going to look at all of these different skills for the mastery. So that means like how people feel like what mastery they need to have in their job, how often they use those skills. So that's frequency here. And then how important those skills are for their jobs. And so here's the heat map here. So when things are darker, that means that they're more important or more frequently used. And if you just squint at this, you'll notice that this management and communication category here is like really strong across the board for a lot of these different jobs. So people that are in industry to consulting to, you know, of course, management jobs, and that's in like higher education and things like that. They need to be able to manage a team. They need to communicate. They need to write. And these are skills that we don't teach our neuroscience graduates often or enough, I think. We can look across the board and kind of like group things here. And if we look at these different categories, again, I know there's like a ton of data here, but on the top, this is mastery, middle is frequency, bottom is importance. And so if we group across these sort of general categories of people that are graduate students or do academic or industry research or are in non-research jobs, so things more like teaching, again, across the board, management, communication, really, really important. So I think one lesson I want to leave with you just from my personal experience, but also supported by this data looking at people's career paths, is that if you can get a chance to like do a little bit more management, and that could be like mentoring someone else, leading a research project, or communicating your research, I think that those are really important skills. Of course, the other things that popped out of the survey are things like technical skills, coding and data analysis. As much as you can develop those skills, that opens up a ton of doors beyond R1 research. So anyway, as a graduate student, I was, sort of finding my way, trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do next. And I went to this course at Cold Spring, or not at Cold Spring Harbor, at up in Washington, called the Summer Workshop on the Dynamic Brain. And at the time I was thinking about a postdoc, and I ran into Anne Churchland at this conference, and I said, "Oh, Ashley, I love your work." I'd been like following her work for a while. And Anne immediately like turned her laptop to me and said, "Ashley, what do you think of this?" And showed me this like retinotopic map from a mouse. And I was like, okay, great. This is someone who like wants to talk science, speaks my language. And I, had like a really good impression of her lab and everything that she was doing. And so that brought me out to Cold Spring Harbor, ultimately for a postdoc. And when I was a postdoc, I was working with NeuroPixels probes. We were one of the earliest labs to get them. So I was super, super privileged to have access to NeuroPixels. And I was trying to figure out a way to use NeuroPixels in a freely moving mouse. And mice are small. NeuroPixels were not built for this purpose. And so we did some work to try to figure out, okay, can we build a device that does this? And can we build a device in a way that we can actually recycle the probes, because they're expensive, so that we can use them across different mice. So as a postdoc, I was doing this kind of research in the lab. But I was also learning things outside of the lab. I learned how to design and carry out a project. I think as a postdoc, this was really like, in terms of project management, the first time I had really like had full ownership over something. I also learned a little bit about how to mentor others in the lab, and started being able to pass that on. And so although at Cold Spring Harbor, there's not a ton of like undergraduates, we have some research technicians and things like that. I was able to get some mentorship experience working with our summer undergraduates, and that I found really, really fun and super valuable. I also learned, again, the importance of mentors in my own life. And you'll notice this is kind of a theme, which is that, finding people that will advocate for you, finding people that care about your life outside of the lab, I think is incredibly important, and in many ways more important than the science that they're doing. And Anne was definitely that for me. At the time, personally, I was also grappling with some like distance. So my partner was living in San Francisco at the time. That's about 3,000 miles from New York. And I was like, this really, really is terrible. We made the best of it. We would do things like bake over Zoom. So you can see that here. But I started realizing like, I don't want to do this forever. And that's really, really hard. And the sort of reality of having to sacrifice, some personal things for my professional life really, really started becoming very real. At the same time, I was also trying to like figure out a way to teach and get some more teaching experience, even though we didn't have an undergraduate population at Cold Spring Harbor. So I started working with a couple of different groups. One of those groups is called Guerrilla Science, and they would do these like very cool things where they would like go set up like little pop-ups and do like informal workshops with people. This was a workshop about like taste perception. So we had all these kind of fun taste tasks, and I gave or sensory tasks, and I gave a short talk in the beginning of this. And I started realizing like, these are the things I was really excited about doing, and really more like drawn to those sort of tasks. And so if I would get to lab in the morning and be like, well, I can like analyze this data, or I can write a science article for this other outlet I was working for called Massive Science. It was like, I want to write the science article. And that was just like what I wanted to do. And I started tuning into that a little bit more kind of over time, realizing like, well, maybe I can do that as a career, maybe actually I can sort of make that the center point rather than the thing I'm doing on the side. And so I really like this quote from Rumi that's related to this. So let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray. And I think especially, as researchers, and when you're surrounded by people who care about research and really, really love research, it can feel like that's the dominant thing, like that's like the most important thing. But I think at the end of the day, you have to pay attention to what you really love and what you really want to do. And I really strongly believe that if you sort of follow that, rather than following the priorities and the values of the people around you, I think that that will bring you to where you need to be. So I was doing some of these really fun things too during this time, just kind of stretching my legs in science communication a little bit more as I started sort of embracing this part of myself. This was an academic stand-up event that I did where I gave a stand-up presentation on my research. It was a lot of work. I wouldn't go into this lightly if you want to try doing stand-up about your research, but it was very fun. It was a really, really good experience. And, so I was grappling with all this. I was like, okay, do I want to keep going in research? I'm far from my partner. Does it make sense to try to go for a faculty job? And I started getting real about the numbers, right? And I think that this is super important for anybody looking at faculty jobs, really trying to figure out where they want to land, right? And so if you look across PhD graduates, you find that about 15%, depending on the field, depending on where they graduate from, find tenure track roles. Another 18% find some sort of non-tenure track positions. About 27%, and then this is maybe now slightly outdated, but this is from about 5 years ago. 27% of biology postdocs will get a tenure track faculty job. It's not actually the worst odds in the world, but there's some odds here, right, that you're trying to work against. If you're in a highly ranked program or from a good university, these numbers are better. They can go up to 30%. So I was, thinking about all this and thinking about kind of the shape of my life. And, this is a quote here that I think is really central to this, and that, it's your life and only if you make it so. And I think that this, I chose this as the title of my talk because I think it's really important that the standards you live by have to be your standards, your values, your convictions, and not the convictions of the people around you or even of the scientific endeavor as a whole. And I think the thing to do during this sort of process of figuring out, well, what is it that you really want to do, and grappling with the statistics of just getting a job is, you have to distill it down to some boxes. And I had boxes I needed to check in my work. And I think this could have brought me down a variety of different roads. So I think that this helps because it's there's not a best job for you. Maybe there's a few really good jobs for you that check all of your boxes. So for me, this was a place where my partner and I really wanted to live and felt safe. And I think that that's an incredibly important thing for us in particular. And also just to live in the same city was really important. I knew that I wanted some degree of creativity and intellectual freedom. One of the amazing things about being a researcher is that you get to kind of make your own decisions, and you can be creative in the way that you solve problems. You can think about things that are interesting. And I wanted to keep doing that. I didn't want to lose that part of my job. And finally, I knew that I wanted to do some sort of communication about science, either to students or to the public. So I think, doing some sort of teaching or any sort of science communication more publicly, writing or something like that, I think I would have been really happy in either one of those kind of paths. But this was really scary. I mean, I think when you spend 5-10 years of your life doing research, the thing that's really familiar because you've been doing it for all this time, you are surrounded by people that know how this works. And then you're choosing to venture out into something else, oh, can I make a job out of teaching? Can I make a job out of writing, or these things that I care about? I think that that's really, really scary. And so I want to acknowledge that it can feel like a jump into the unknown, but you never know, right? It could be really nice on the other side. So I then around this time got this email that's from someone that I used to work with at UCSD through the high school teaching program that I mentioned. They forwarded me this job title that said neurobiology teaching professor position. And I forwarded this to my partner and I was like, oh, what is this? And this looks amazing. And this was one of the sort of first moments in my life that I would call an Oprah yes moment. And this comes from this interview that Oprah did with Cheryl Strayed, where she's talking about like how she makes decisions between things in her life. And if something is like an absolute yes, like as soon as you see it, you're like, yes, that's a thing I want to do. We now call that an Oprah yes in our household. So this was an Oprah yes for me for sure. And I applied to this job, super fortunate to have gotten in. I'm very happy to talk in case folks are curious about these kinds of jobs, you know, what that entails. But for me, I was like, yeah, this checks all the boxes for me. So I moved back to San Diego, and this is where I am now. And my job has kind of three different major components here. So I teach, of course, so it's a teaching professor job. I do scholarship that includes things like writing, curriculum development, education research, and I do service at the university. So, you know, you'll notice this looks like a research job in a lot of ways, except the weighting of these things is a little bit different, right? For research faculty, the weight is really on your research and are you getting grants and all of that stuff. For me, it's like a little bit more balanced across these three things. So for me, when I'm teaching, something I've been focused on a lot is trying to create accessible materials for teaching coding in a neurobiology context. I mentioned that I was thrown into coding as a graduate student. Probably many of you were thrown into coding at one stage in your career. And it's really, really important now for your students to know how to code, I think, or at least have some exposure to it to figure out if it's something they want to do. So that's something I've been trying to integrate into my curriculum here. In terms of service, as mentioned in the introduction, I run an R25 program called STARTneuro, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then I also direct our BS to MS program in biology. And then finally, in terms of scholarship, I'm thinking about a few different things these days. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in teaching neuro students how to code. And I'm interested in the skills and career paths of neuroscientists. So some of the research I showed you earlier, where we're surveying people, asking about their skill sets, that's all a part of the research that I'm doing now. So for teaching, this has been really, really fun. I was hired basically to teach a neurobiology lab course. So that course code is called BIPN 145. And I was basically hired, given a bunch of money to build rigs, basically like starting a new lab, right? And trying to figure out, okay, like what can we do in an undergraduate lab setting with 42 undergraduates simultaneously? Like what kinds of experiments can we do? So we do a variety of things. We do EEG recordings. We actually did that on Wednesday. We do recordings from earthworms, which are like super easy to record from. We do intracellular recordings in Leech. This is my pride and joy, because getting 14 rigs going with an intracellular recording simultaneously is like a real feat of passion. And on the right-hand side here, you can see these are three students that a couple quarters ago filled a Leech Retzius cell. So you can see the cell fill on the right-hand side here. So they did that. That was their hard work. So this is how I spend these days, like during the school year, 10 hours of my week, I'm in this course with students. I'm in the lab Wednesday and Friday afternoons. It has a lecture too, so I'm teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday as well. So this is really kind of like the bread and butter of my job. I teach a couple other things, like I teach a coding class, not surprisingly. So it's an intro coding class for biology students. And then I also teach a couple of classes to our master's students that are a little bit more like skills-based master's classes. So in terms of that, like coding class, you know, I've also been trying to do some research to try to understand how do we teach coding to biology students, because biology students, a lot of them chose biology to like avoid topics like computer science and math, right? I don't know if anybody can relate to that, but you know, maybe you choose biology because you're like, well, I'm not a physics person, I'm not a math person. But I really like science, so biology sounds really good. And then students get into the biology major and they realize, well, shoot, I have to learn how to code. I still have to learn some quantitative skills, and then they take my class. And so I'm super interested to know what happens over the course of the class. Like, how do their mindsets change as they get this first introduction to coding? And so this is just kind of a glimpse of some of the research I'm doing now, where we're using these different inventories, and you can see a lot of the single items below. So these are published survey inventories that are assessing attitudes towards coding. And so these different items kind of fall into different buckets. And so this first bucket that you'll see on the left-hand side here says fixed mindset. So a lot of times when people start to code, they have these beliefs about what coding means. And the first belief on the top here, I worry that mistakes I make when writing a program may damage my computer, is actually something that a lot of people think before taking the class. This is the item that shifts the most over the course of the class. So at the end of the class, people are way less worried about actually damaging their computer, which is good, right? Because that's a big impediment. If you want to learn how to code, you have to like trust that you're not going to break things. And so this is something that goes down over the course of the class. So you take a bunch of items like this that are about this approach to coding, and we put that under fixed mindset. And so over the course of the class, students' fixed mindset goes down. They start to see it more of like a growth process, much more of like a flexible thing, less tied to their identity also as coders or not. Other things we're assessing are things like, do they think it's useful in biology? And do they have personal interests? And in this particular quarter, we don't see these things shift very much, but we're also doing some qualitative interviews with students to try to understand, what are they thinking now? What's different? And where do they see the intersections between biology and coding? So this is work that I do with a couple folks who help out. So this is Lily and Austin on the right-hand side. And Austin is actually a PhD student who's working with me, who's actually going to do his dissertation research on this exact topic. And we're probably going to do a growth mindset intervention in the class where we try to even shift their mindsets a little bit more using an intervention. So I also mentioned that I run this STARTneuro R25 program. So this started 3 years ago, and this has been a really big and meaningful part of my job. So every year we bring 10 students who are transferring into UCSD who are interested in neuroscience, and we work with them starting in the summer, but then we spend the next 2 years with them, mentoring them and paying them to work in research labs. And so as Dr. Hollis mentioned in the introduction, it's really hard for transfer students to get their feet on the ground when they get to UCSD, and even harder to get into research labs and pursue graduate school and life as a researcher. And so the goal of our program is to help these students find research labs, give them the support and funding that they need in order to be successful in that. We are just graduating our first cohort now, actually. So there a couple of folks are going into postbac or master's programs. And our hope is that, over the years, we'll see like more of our students going into PhD programs and actually pursuing that path when they might not have without this kind of support. So not surprisingly, this also actually comes with some assessment with it. And so this is assessment that, again, is led by Austin, a PhD student that I work with. And we're trying to evaluate the impact of our program. And we do that in a few different ways. So we try to understand, how do students' research knowledge increase? How does their self-efficacy research increase? And so like, this is asking things like, I feel confident doing research, or I feel like I know what I'm doing when I'm doing research. And so even just after our summer program with them, which is about 10 weeks, they have huge gains in these different areas. So over the summer, we're like teaching them about neuroscience. We're teaching them how to do these different skills in the lab. And it's really nice that some of these things increase over the summer too. A lot of things we're looking at too are things like, do they feel like they have more of an identity as a scientist? Do they feel like they have any shifts in their sort of like sense of belonging in the program or on campus? And some of these things shift a little bit over the summer, but we're actually seeing these shift much more over the course of like a year or two, because we're still sort of doing this research more and more. So this is a big sort of field of research that is totally new to me, like as someone who is trained in neuroscience, like learning how to do evaluation work and interviews has been like a big learning experience, but really, really fun, because this is still like data that I get to play with and understand and try to probe, try to understand like the impacts of the program that we're running. So when I was a postdoc too, I got my second Oprah Yes. And this Oprah Yes came from an editor at Columbia University who said, I like follow you. I see this sort of stuff that you're writing online. do you ever want to write a book about writing about neuroscience? And I was like, yes, this sounds great. And so during my first year here, I was writing this book, and learned that it requires a lot of planning, a lot of humility, and a lot of networking. And so, it took a lot of like scoping out time to write it during the first summer of my job, and also some nights and weekends, and a lot of humility in terms of just how much time it takes in order to do something like write a book. And then a lot of networking, because I interviewed a lot of people, and some of the interviews are directly in the book, but a lot of them just really helped like me understand the field a little bit better, because I didn't want this to just be like my book. I wanted it to be representative of where I thought the field was, more people in the field were how they were thinking about things. So this was in the end a ton of fun, and something that I think I'm really proud of, and was like a first foray into like what it means to really like take on a project of this size. Since then, and a big part of my job too has been writing for outlets like the Science Foundation or Simons Foundation. So Simons, as you probably know, funds a lot of research, and they also have a really awesome neuroscience blog. And so this has been a really fun part of my job, because it allows me to talk to scientists. Like I reached out to Honghui Zhang from the Allen Institute and was like, hey, can we talk about your recent paper? And, had a meeting with her. And that's been really, really cool. A really nice way for me to sort of like stay in tune with what the field is thinking about, and allows me to kind of continue to stretch my legs in science writing too, which has been really great. I've also written a little bit, starting to write for the Chronicle. So the Chronicle is a higher education outlet. And if you're someone who's thinking about teaching jobs, this article might actually be really interesting to you or relevant. I'm happy to like talk about, details of what these tracks look like, of course. But there's some details in this article as well that, my goal is like to spread the word about my job, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand what it means to be like a tenure track teaching professor. So that a lot of that is in this article too. So looking back, I think there's a few kind of lessons that I can sort of pull out of my own experience. The first thing is definitely overcoming feelings of not belonging. And, I'm a first generation scientist, and my family members definitely don't understand what it means to be in academia or in science. And so there's a lot of like moving in spaces, and even now still moving in spaces where I don't feel like I belong. And it's really, really hard to like try to put that aside and just, try to take up space even when I think I don't deserve it. And that's definitely something I've had to like work on, and has been a really important feature of my job. I think also listening to sort of your instincts, and sort of thinking back to this, like, the idea from Rumi about like really following it, what it is that you love, I think is super important. I think all the momentum was there for me to go into and try to get like a research job, but I think instinctually that's not where my heart was. And I am happy that I listened to that in the end, even though I didn't know where it would lead me. I followed that instinct, and it brought me here, and I'm really, really happy in my job. And so I really believe that if you follow that, it'll bring you somewhere that's closer to kind of where you want to be. I think something related to that was, telling other people about kind of what I wanted in my career. And the very first person, I showed you the screenshot, the very first person that forwarded me the job ad was someone who I just called up because I said, like, look, you're in education, and I don't really know what this kind of job looks like, but I am interested in a kind of job that's teaching, but is like a little bit more stable than being an adjunct or something like that. And if there's anything like that ever, like, please, I'd love to know about it. And so I kind of voiced that desire to her on like a quick phone call, just to kind of like catch up and see if there was anything in her world that she knew about. And then she was the first person to forward me this job ad. And I later saw it, but it gave me like an additional few days to start working on the job application. And like, I think, that probably strengthened my application. And so I think, as much as you can, especially when you're navigating these spaces where there's not like a clear path. I think as much as you can talk to people that you know and ask questions and ask for leads on anything, I think is really, really important. I think something I've learned too is that choosing environments over like promised outcomes is really important. So what I mean by that is like, you know, choosing the mentors to work with that create an environment of learning, create an environment where it's okay to make mistakes and will support you in whatever your career path is for you. I think choosing that over like promised outcomes like, oh, well, you'll definitely get a really great paper out of this lab, or you'll definitely land a job after this lab. I just think choosing the environment is really important, and ultimately is going to help you, one, be a happier person, and two, could help you down the line in ways that you might not even know yet. And then the third thing here is, or the fifth thing is showing gratitude to folks who have made it possible. So I think it's really important all along the way to like pay it forward and to pay it back to, you know, the people that who have helped you. And I think that that's something I try to do, and I think is really really important in for all of us. A thought that I want to leave you with too is that there's a lot of different jobs out there, and I think it can really feel, especially when you're a postdoc, that, you know, there's just like R1 or bust. And there are many, many different jobs. You can find many happy people in those jobs too. Like I think a lot of people fear like that they're not going to be able to be happy outside of R1 research, or they're like going to be like lacking something. And I really don't think that's true. I think that there's a lot of different ways to be happy, a lot of different jobs that you can be happy with. And just kind of being open to that, I think, is really, really important. I'll leave you with this quote that I really like. This is a book that I picked up actually when I was a postdoc. It's kind of a silly book, but it's beautifully illustrated and has a lot of nice ideas in it. And so this says, all too often we feel that we are not living the fullness of our lives because we're not expressing the fullness of our gifts. And so I think that it's really important, like as you're sort of taking stock of where you are and where you're going next, is that you're thinking about like, what are your gifts and what are your values, and coming up with the boxes to check and using that as the guide to like what you should do with your life, and not just what you must do. Like, you know, what you like, or sorry, you should think about what you must do. Like, what are the sort of non-negotiables, right? Versus what everybody is telling you, you know, in terms of like what you should do. So follow the must, like do the thing that you must do that's like totally non-negotiable for you. Don't listen to the lessons around you from everybody else, or in terms of what they prioritize. Okay, so that is all I wanted to tell you. I'm super happy to like chat about anything, you know, any questions that you have. And thanks again for having me.
Ashley, thank you. That was fantastic. I mean, there are so many points that you went across, different aspects of your career progression and choices you made, how you got to certain places. We will open up for questions in a second. I wanted to say, you know, a few things. I think that career arc, that change in career apprehension that you're saying, you know, getting out of your comfort zone, that also applies to those of us that have taken the step from postdoc to PI. You know, when you get that letter that says, oh, we're going to give you this much money, you know, based on your expertise in 2-photon imaging. You know, did I overstate my case a little? Maybe. What have I got myself into? And I'm going to be responsible for all these other people's livelihoods. So
yeah, I think it's hard when one day you're a postdoc and the next day you're a faculty member. And it's not like something has dramatically changed from day one to day two, but all of a sudden you have like a ton more responsibilities. People expect you to know things, like everything. That's just not the case. You're still that person you were yesterday.
Like you said, those skills, right? The management, the communication skills that you need aren't necessarily all that polished on day one of being a PI. So there is a little bit of apprehension, like, oh, I'm going to move my entire family all the way across the country and everything's going to be fine, right? I promise it'll be fine.
Yeah, totally.
You know, everything's on fire, but you know, everything's fine. All right, well, let's open up for some questions because I have plenty of things to discuss, but let's see what other people have. There will also be an open discussion section with Ashley if you're not comfortable with the PIs, but questions you have based on her discussion today, that'd be great. So is there anybody in the chat or anybody with a hand? Ian, I'm going to call on you. I'm going to single you out. I know you already had a conversation before this. Oh, Najet's coming online here. All right. Ian,
Hi, Ashley. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the talk and sharing your experience with us. So my question is, how did you manage, or how did you deal with your job as educator, let's say the first couple of years, shifting completely from the research field to education and being with students in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I think this was a leap of faith too, because like I had never taught full time. I had like taught a little bit, but always like in parallel with research, right? So I was like, gosh, I hope I like this because, I'm taking this job where I'm going to be teaching, literally in the classroom, 10 to 15 hours a week. So, I mean, it was a little bit of a transition, but I think a really good one for me. I mean, I think for me, the kind of like energy and the kind of reward that I get from, being in the classroom with students and the kind of like immediate feedback you get from that has been really, really rewarding. There are definitely days that are frustrating. I hate grading, of course, because I also just like hate feeling like a gatekeeper for students. And like, so there's aspects of my job like that I don't enjoy. And, like right now it's like May and we've been like going pretty much straight since January. So it's like, starting to like be the end of the quarter and I'm like ready for it to be over. So I'm a little more tired of teaching and things like that. So there's definitely these like, swings of like how much, I want to be in the classroom or how engaged I am in that part of my job. But I would say on the whole, it's been a really positive shift for me. I mean, I think I started feeling at the end of my postdoc, like some of the things I had to do on the day-to-day, like working with mice, doing mouse surgeries, and like that really started like wearing on me quite a bit. And so the shift to more like interaction with people, more immediate feedback, that was really, really welcome in my life. Yeah. And it's been a lot of learning too. I mean, and that's something I love. Like I had to learn a ton to teach my lab class. Like I'd never done earthworm recordings, so like there was actually a ton of learning I had to do when I first started. And I didn't teach the lab class until the second quarter I was here. So the first quarter was basically like doing trial experiments, just like you would in a lab setting, right? It's like, testing out things, trying to develop a protocol. And, that was really fun. And so there has been and still continues to be a lot of learning with that, which I really enjoy.
I noticed the boot camp inspired class setting there. Did you
Yep.
like pin down like Bill or Kathy or something? Like, did you?
Yes. No, I had to. I absolutely had to, because also I'm not a leech electrophysiologist. So so absolutely. I took advantage of Bill and Kathy and Eduardo Macaño, who's here, to get all the rigs up and running, to understand what we were looking at. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that similarity popped out. All right.
Can I piggyback off of Najet and Edmund's question? So and I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks so much. The learning and progressing, and like you said, like going in, you don't really know how it is, right? And we ask these questions to more like traditional track PIs all the time. And I like to ask, like, how has your role changed, or what do you think have you done to get better at managing or things like that? Like as far as the teaching, is that also the same? I imagine you're having to evolve your teaching style, and you had a little bit of background as a TA and then teaching a course in your grad school times. But does your pedagogy, like, does your format evolve as well? Like, how have you developed as a faculty now, I guess, is my question. And how do you know to do that? I mean, obviously you get to pick things that work and things that don't work, but just curious.
No, absolutely. I mean, there have been some forced changes to my pedagogy, which is like the pandemic and online learning, and all of a sudden like had to teach a lab class online and figure out what that looked like. So, there have been some unwelcome changes to my teaching style, but in terms of like intentional changes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, every quarter I basically have a document where I'm like tracking things I want to change, and I try not to change everything all at once, because it's an experiment, right? I want to change like one variable at a time in my teaching and then see how that plays out. And sometimes that's informed by my observations of what I think is working in the classroom. Sometimes it's informed by reading about other approaches taken by other people, or I'll go to like a seminar and someone talks about like spec grading, for example, which is like a very different grading system. And I maybe start integrating like some pieces of that into my teaching to try sort of like test it out. Yeah, so I'm constantly changing the way I teach. The other thing is that I've been teaching some new classes too. So like this intro to Python for biologist class is totally new. I proposed it. It's inspired by some classes I've seen at other universities, but it's totally new here. And so thinking about like, okay, how do I teach that class, which is a totally different class than like the lab class, and it's a different student population. Absolutely, like I'm still learning and iterating on that every time I teach it.
All right, thanks. Did you have another question or?
A lot, but I think I will communicate with her later
During the
through
discussion.
email.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You mentioned about paying it forward, paying it back to the people that have helped you get there. I think, it's nice. You started to get your first batch of these students in the program, the transfer students, into post-bac programs and things like that. I know that coming through the community college, the professors, they usually have smaller classes, and oftentimes they do get very invested in the students. So they do like to hear about their successes. I mean, they do like to find out when you go into grad school, things like that. I've definitely experienced that. So I think that's a welcome thing to get back to them.
I have a question, Edmund.
Raj,
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. What a terrific talk. I think one of the questions that often comes up is when people are looking for hiring somebody like you, what were the critical skill sets or experiences that you had that made you competitive for this position? And what would you be advising people who, say, have declared an interest in a teaching career as to how now in the middle of their postdocs they may reshape their experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the big thing, not surprisingly, is teaching experience, right? And not just informal experience, and not just being a teaching assistant, but often being an instructor of record. So you've taught a college level class like at least once. I think that's depends on the job. Maybe it's not like a super hard requirement, but I would say that's like something to strive for. If you can get teaching experience, at a community college, even for like one semester, if you can teach, some sort of structured thing, even like a summer workshop course where like you develop the curriculum and like you're, determining the pedagogical approaches, whatever it might be. I think if you have some experience like that under your belt, not only will that make you hireable for a job like mine, but also it's valuable experience for you to know if you enjoy that sort of thing, right? Like, because I think being the teaching assistant is a little bit different than being the person like structuring the classroom, thinking about what you're teaching, all of that stuff. So I do think that's super valuable.
Right.
For me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was just gonna say that I really appreciate, I mean, Ian's heard me talk about this in the lab before. I constantly harp on this idea of skills, but I think there is a corollary, and I think you alluded to it a lot, and that is that it's not only skill acquisition, but it's values that go associated with those skills, and kind of an approach to whatever you do, where I collaboration, integrity, all of those things that we kind of take for granted, but which really are important as people are looking at you as a potential hire. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the same way that, when you apply for a research job, people are assessing what are your like priorities and values in your research, I think that's true for teaching jobs as well. And I think, you know, at UCSD and in a lot of places, like we're looking for people who are very student-centered, where your values are like, how do we help the students? And everything grows out of that. And in addition to that, how do we help students that would normally, you know, or historically haven't been able to get to the next stage, right? How do we help like our Hispanic and Black students that are here, like at UC San Diego? And like, you know, so in terms of like values match, yeah, we're looking for people who care and, you know, who are very values forward, who aren't in it for, you know, the popularity context of being the coolest professor, right? Which is like very rarely the case, but that everything, you know, in all the ways that people talk about their teaching and ultimately like come give a teaching demonstration for us, you know, it's very much like, is that like singing out of them when they write their teaching statement? Like, is it super clear that they're here for the right reasons and want to be collaborative and everything, as you said? So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that stuff is really, really important.
Great. Thank you. Thank you again. So we're going to have just an open session for you with our trainees and trainees from downtown Weill Cornell. Welcome to stay on as well if you have questions for Dr. Jauvinett. Thank you, Ashley. It was fantastic, and you know, really, I think will help open the eyes of some of the people that are on, you know, interested not just in the teaching aspect of career, which I know we have, and you're going to get questions. There's just lining them all up right now, but also in people just taking stock of what their desires are, what their values are, and how to use that to address their goals, their career goals. So thank you again so much. It was a fantastic talk, and
Yeah, thanks for having me.